Hi. We recently constructed a Promised Neighborhoods Planning Initiative proposal, which, I mean, as we first thought, oh my God, this is impossible. And then as we kind of broke the barriers and within a month's time got our MOUs together and realized that we've already been collaborating on multiple levels with pretty much all of the agencies that we have the MOU with, which is like a few dozen. And we are working with Social Solutions, I mean, it's a long shot to even get the grant, but we decided we want to move forward with this regardless because the Humboldt Park community so desperately needs it. In fact, Erie House is one of our collaborators.
Yeah, I say, are you from
Aspira. Mm-hmm. So my question is, and I really liked what you had said about Fry, and also I really liked your story about the White Center project. I'm curious to know how all this came about in terms of who approached the Annie EKC Foundation, and how did it come about? And this place-based funding is such a new term now. Social Solutions in a meeting with us recommended we look for funders that do place-based funding, and when I went to the donors forum orientation at the library, they never heard of place-based funding, and they're supposed to be the experts on it. So how do we go about, finding it? We really want to lift this off the ground. It's a very vital initiative that needs to happen in the Humboldt Park community.
Yeah, I think you had about 5 questions in there. I think you're right on this place-based funding. I think in the last panel, folks talked about kind of words that gain currency. There have been a set of community development funders, comprehensive community funders, community building funders. There is a whole network of them, and I'd be happy to, some in Chicago that have done this, obviously Staines, MacArthur, some others, but there's a whole national set of them as well. I'd be happy to talk to you about them. As far as White Center, it's kind of a odd story. I mean, as a national foundation, we sort of dream up ideas, go out and try to find partners in different places, and essentially that's how White Center, but it emerged, but it really grew out of a couple of prior initiatives. I started there in the early 90s with a jobs initiative. There was also a teen pregnancy initiative that was in White Center. So for a foundation, and this is kind of the way we work and recommend, is you kind of build on those relationships so that you can actually, and this is a hard thing for national funders, you have some sense of what's real on the ground, who should you go to, what communities are doing stuff. I mean, that's kind of how we approach it. And you don't always get it right because you can't figure out really what's going on 3,000 miles from Baltimore. I mean, but you can try. And I probably missed 2 or 3 of your other questions, so if you want.
Did you also bring in, you started with a jobs initiative in this area, but did you also bring in other funders that would be interested in maybe piggybacking on what you were doing?
Well, I didn't say as much of this. Our funding is ending there now, and for a national funder, this really gets to the metrics of success, is have you brought in other funders of different kinds and different stakeholders to make sure that that platform of capacity is sustainable. Because what often happens with different kinds of initiatives, they're there for 4 years and then they're gone. And I think for our kind of work that's across generations, you really need to have a platform that lasts for decades. So we brought in Gates, and we brought in Paul Allen and the Community Foundation and Boeing and many others, and it's one of the tricks of collaboration to always leave enough kind of empty chairs at the table where others can come in and very quickly take ownership and let their, bring their identity to it. So that's a key.
So how is that community doing now? Is the job rates higher? Are the educational rates higher? Quality of life, livability?
I would, it's a good question. When I mentioned, that population level results in many of these initiatives have not changed, I would probably say if you looked at the indicators across that 25,000, I'm not quite sure they've changed a lot, particularly given the recession. But if you drill down into, for example, at SeaTac Airport, it used to be that new immigrant refugees into the area couldn't get jobs there because they couldn't figure out how to get the right kind of documentation together to get jobs. We now have a pipeline where hundreds of them have gotten jobs there. Or if you drill down into the links between the early childhood center and the schools and the really incorporation of language and culture and success, you'll see indicators going up. So I think you start seeing them that way. Have they all come together? No, and that's sort of a challenge, I think, for all of us.
Well, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one other thing for us is how do residents feel about where they are? And that's actually, that's kind of how we measure our success in a certain sense. Do they feel as if they belong there? What has there been an increase, for example, in their residential stability as a result of there being better housing options or a place to go if they find that they are in trouble and need some other kind of resources? So has that resource network actually become visible to residents in a way that they understand it and that they feel that their quality of life somehow has gotten better as a result?
Hi. So it's already been mentioned a few times how challenging it is to administer federal funding. And as I'm listening to the scope of these projects, the number of players involved, thinking about the administrative process, frankly, makes me shudder a little bit. So my question to you guys is, how do you manage all of that? The internal controls, implementing a reporting process, data collection, handling auditors, et cetera, and still maintain your sanity and remain within the federal budget caps for administrative portion of the funding?
I won't answer that one because the university situation is quite a lot different. We have a whole host of people that require us to report in a very particular way, and they're on us all the time, so that one is a little different as well.
Yeah, I think, again, I mean, the point you bring up is, a good thing of why we don't want to discourage people applying for these larger federal grants is not for the faint-hearted and certainly not for the disorganized. So agencies, like I mentioned, in our collaborative, 3 of them are over 100 years old. So we kind of have figured out how to manage money or we wouldn't still be there. And that's part of the confidence, level we can lend to a collaborative to say there's this kind of experience there. But yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous burden. I don't know how our financial office, our people who work there, I can't tell you how many times, I get emails from them at 8 o'clock at night, and I sometimes email back, what are you still doing there? Well, they have no choice. The multiple complexities of contracts is burdensome. But on the other hand, it's what we do.
I would just add to that, in the White Center context, I mentioned we started a community development corporation. One of the mistakes lots of communities make is they start a new organization and then that organization gets totally, they cave in from trying to deal with federal contracts and everything else. And I think, I heard this on the last panel, how do you bring in partners to handle that? So when this CDC was going to do housing, they didn't do the housing. They found it the best CDC in town that knew how to deal with tax credits and weave together all that, and they brought them in as a partner. And I think this partnering issue is a key one to spread some of that administrative pain, because if you're not careful, you can really kill authentic, grounded organizations that are as important for capacity as some of the implementers.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Thank you. I'd like, I think, Ms. Dearborn to help me with this. You did mention in your presentation that part of the challenge was to transfer the persons that you were sending out the expertise to the youth, and that you usually depended upon older people in the community to help you get the platform started. But other than faith-based organizations, can you tell me physically where you found people that you could make that liaison with to begin your program?
Well, they were initially a lot of the older residents of the neighborhood, but what we found over time, particularly as we were actually able to bring a for-profit builder in to build some new housing, and once there was new housing, we were able to attract younger families, and those younger families were very interested in developing the neighborhood, having the parks be safe so their kids had a place to play, improving the school system, those kind of things. And so it built over time. I think also building capacity in some of our partners, so some of the community development corporations that were just getting started maybe 15 years ago, now have a track record and are actually have programs that now address some of the youth issues, for example, and are a venue for us to bring youth into the equation. So we're actually working with, for example, girls in the middle school, some people who have left school, and working with them on job training, for example. So, and not us, but some of our partners, and that's happened over time as they've built their capacity and began to understand what the issues are in their neighborhood and who they partner with to work on addressing those issues. So it's kind of happened over time, but there has been from the beginning an acknowledgement that it needs to, that the older residents need to transfer that responsibility and sort of the care for the neighborhood to the younger generations. And that was what was missing when we first went there 20 years ago.
If I could just add to that a couple things about the idea of, where do you start, or how do you decide what organizations can really have the capacity to come together. And I would really recommend two things. One is if you can find, and I can't remember the name of the book, but there's a case study write-up by Ken Reardon, who was one of Lynn's predecessors, and he wrote the story of how the East St. Louis project got started and the university's role. And I used to teach it myself because it's one of the best stories of how to do it wrong first and then how to get it right the second time. And they really looked for, community institutions, and there are some. Even in what you might think is the most under-resourced area, almost everyone has a church of some sort, or a synagogue, or a mosque, or whatever. And actually, in the case of East St. Louis, as I recall, there actually was a settlement house. And that's where Ken started his conversations, just to get a feel for who's here, who should I know, who should I talk to, talk to gatekeepers. And then the other thing is, a whole approach to what's called asset-based community development. And I've also done this with students, where you really look carefully, not at the name brand institutions that will make your life easy if you find them, but the less well-known organizations, connections, block clubs, sewing circles, whatever, where people gather, and you'll probably find people there that can get you started on the right track of who to work with in a particular neighborhood.
I want to thank the panelists for a tremendously lively conversation.